Good evening, lovely people, and welcome. I am definitely Neil Oliver, and I am definitely live on GB News TV and on radio. Coming up on the show this evening, on this historic day for the nation, I'll be discussing UK sovereignty with the doctors Kay Lindley and Robert Malone. Who will truly reign over us when we sign up to the WHO's Pandemic Preparedness Treaty? And I'll also be joined by the lawyer Francis Hoare, who says I'm worrying about nothing because the UK will always have the final say. All of that, plus plenty chat with my brilliant panellist, Andrew Eborn. But first, an update on the latest news. But our Constitution does exist, and it carefully puts ultimate power beyond the reach of government or any other usurper. Our Constitution enshrines ultimate power where it belongs, with the people. To anyone who says our Constitution was superseded by the act of any government, I ask, do you accept a government can gather unto itself the power to do whatever it likes? If the answer is yes, then I say you accept despotism and tyranny. Here's the thing. I want someone somewhere to respect us enough to tell us the truth about Britain today. Then we'll know where we stand. Do the powers that be truly regard us as free people living in a sovereign nation, or do they not? Today of all days, it's not too much to ask. All of that's my opinion, of course, and you're free to disagree. Keep the tweets and emails coming all through the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk and you can tweet me as well at gbnews, and I'll get to some of your comments later in the show if time permits. Joining me tonight, broadcaster and lawyer Andrew Eborn. Andrew, are we a sovereign nation?
Well, I think it's fascinating, your summary of what's just happened today. And one of the phrases that Charles, now King Charles, crowned as we speak, one of the phrases they use is he's not here to be served, but to serve. And to your point about whether we're a sovereign nation or whether we have free will, the reality is we get to choose once every 4 years, and then we're under a dictatorship, if you like, for that 4-year period. So you're right, all of our freedoms, if you like, we give away during that 4-year period.
But do we, though? Oughtn't we to be governed ourselves by, for example, trial by jury, where the justice of the law is judged as well as the guilt or innocence of the person brought before that court and that jury?
Well, what people would say is that you judge basically by the ballot box. That's when you're allowed to do it. And your point about politicians is they're in the business of getting re-elected. So you need to have some sort of stability, if you like, for the nation. And that's why I think the sovereign, the powers that the sovereign now have are limited in comparison to what they used to have generations ago. And to a great extent, they're a figurehead. It's great for our,
right?
Tourism.
Oughtn't we to have that restraint on government power in the form of a constitutional monarch, if indeed we live in a constitutional monarchy, that otherwise a government will legislate and put itself in a position of absolute power?
Well, that's the difficulty about that, and what they're saying is that you've got every 4 years you have that choice. And if people don't deliver, then you have the ability to get rid of them. But during that period, you need to give them the power, if you like. You're ceding power during that 4-year period to make them effect laws and bring in that sort of protection.
Our ancient tradition invested power in the people in every moment of every day by trial by jury, by which, as I say, the justice of the law itself was judged in every case. And it's by that application of people power that we restrain the legislative who would otherwise just write, enact and punish in the light of whatever laws they see.
It's interesting, but you've also got to give people a relevant period of time in order to affect certain things. You cannot govern, not everybody can govern because there'll be complete chaos. You need to basically delegate some sort of responsibility for ensuring those fundamental things, because otherwise it just wouldn't work, is the reality. So that's what we try and do. That's where the electorate sort of works on that sort of basis. That's where democracy should work, but it's working every 4 years. And as I say, you've got a democratic right, that period, but once every 4 years.
I say every 4 years isn't good enough. After the break, we'll be joined by family physician Kay Lindley, president of the Texas branch of the American Academy of Physicians. And a surgeon, she has recently returned from the European Parliament, and we'll be discussing with her what went on. See you in a few minutes.
The other instrument is pandemic treaty. Pandemic treaty needs to be ratified in Senate in the United States by 2/3 of the vote. But there is some contention that actually can also bypass the Senate. So I think it's important that every country looks into how these things are going to be implemented, because I do think that there are backdoors. There is probably already legislation in place that it will be implemented.
Bear with me while I bring in my panelist here in the studio today, a lawyer, Andrew, how do you react to what Dr. Lindley is saying there?
Well, I've read the report, and I think it's the treaty, and I've read various diatribes on it, and basically they're saying it's a voluntary treaty, which is in draft form. There are a number of things it says about not interfering with sovereignty. In fact, the very first line of it, it reaffirms the principle of sovereignty of state parties in addressing public health matters. I mean, that's what it says there. And dealing with the other points, and there is nowhere in there which talks about lockdowns, closures, contact tracing, or online speech, and so on and so forth. As I say, so looking at a 32-page document, I think we need to say, well, what does it actually say, rather than what we think it might say?
Kat, you're listening to that. That sounds as though we don't have anything to worry about, because sovereignty will always be key. And this is the cleft stick I find myself in as a reasonable person paying attention. Are we about to lose sovereignty or not?
So I appreciate his response, but I would say that we actually need to be very careful. There is a difference between pandemic treaty and the international health regulation amendments. In the amendments themselves, there are several provisions that need to be very concerning. They actually remove the whole line about human rights and start talking about equity. They talk about creating a censorship campaign on misinformation, disinformation, as I call it, WHO version of Ministry of Truth. They talk about using different regulations and things to approve the new products. And they definitely talk about that they can decide what type of measures are implemented if we have another pandemic. Also, the Director General can go into a region if there is a perceived health emergency, look at it, declare a pandemic, and then definitely close border closures and lockdowns. So I respectfully disagree. I appreciate his comments, but even let's say that I'm a little bit too cautious and a little bit too worried. I think we learned these past 3 years that it's better to be on guard and look into this. As I like to say, better be safe than sorry.
Absolutely. Dr. Kay Lindley, thank you so much for your time this evening. I have simply run out of time. Such an important topic. Thank you for your contribution this evening. Now, don't go away. We will continue this discussion shortly with vaccine scientist Dr. Robert Malone. Welcome back. My next guest is Dr. Robert Malone, a scientist, author and public speaker, a very familiar face and name for those who've been following the story of the COVID pandemic from the beginning, and in particular those listening out for voices that ran counter to the official narrative. Welcome, Dr. Robert Malone.
Thank you, Neil. It's such a pleasure to see you again. I'm glad you're doing well, and I'm glad you're still broadcasting from GB News.
I do my best, Robert. It feels to me, under the terms of this treaty, that we're moving inexorably towards a one-size-fits-all, one-government solution being sought to a multivariate problem. How do you feel about that direction of travel?
So the basic logic is that of a centralized global command economy. I'm choosing words that don't have a lot of burdens around them in terms of alternate meaning. In terms of your conversational moment with my friend Kat, you asked about the potential enforcement arm. What I've heard proposed is that the World Trade Organization would function as that enforcement arm for the World Health Organization. So the potential enforcement, should a nation state not comply with the mandates from Mr. Tedros, and it is, let us be clear, Mr. Tedros can declare a public health emergency for any reason, and he can declare whatever measures he might deem appropriate. So the absence of specific measures in the 32-page document is irrelevant. What it would grant is the ability to implement whatever measures should be deemed appropriate. Would Mr. Tedros, you might ask yourself, act in an arbitrary and capricious manner? The concept of sovereignty is obsolete. It's an anachronism.
Bear with me, Dr. Malone. Andrew, Eborn, how do you respond to that? I know what you said about what Kay Lindley had to say,
yes,
but it seems like what we're hearing again is this possibility that there is a very real threat to sovereignty.
And it's absolutely right that we ask these questions. I always say question everything, but let's look at the facts. And the right people to answer those are those involved in the discussion. I would also make the point that it's a draft document, so all of these concerns need to be addressed to make sure we get the protection. But let me just deal with that one point. It says it doesn't override. So the Associated Press, they asked the US Department of Health and Human Services, and they confirmed it is false to claim that the World Health Organization has now or will have, by virtue of these activities, any authority to direct US health policy or national health emergency response actions. The agency also wrote the WHO has no such enforcement mechanisms, and its non-binding recommendations to member states are just that, non-binding.
Dr. Malone, listening to that, how is a person like myself, who's caught in the middle of all this, listening to both sides, to decide whether or not, as you say, we're in real danger of the loss of sovereignty, while on the other hand, there are other strong voices and strong opinions saying it's non-binding and nation-states will always have the final say? How is someone like me to discern the truth?
So the earlier version of the draft absolutely indicated that it was binding. This is now a revised version, consequent largely to objections from the African and Latin American states, particularly Brazil. There have been these revisions. As correctly noted, these are draft documents currently in negotiation. Yeah. What we have seen is a chronic pattern of incrementalism. So one sees these types of language, and you'll notice that the language that's been inserted now, it differs from the prior draft of the IHR, which the gentleman may or may not have referred to previously or reviewed. What we see is a softening of language in a very non-specific fashion. So we don't see specific statements that there will not be breaches of sovereignty, but rather we see indications of intent. After the last 3 years, I personally, and I think many colleagues, have become rather wary of soft statements of intent or good intent. We've come to the point where we believe that these types of freedoms, these types of international treaties and agreements need to be stated very, very explicitly, lest they be interpreted in the context of some future event as being more permissive or promiscuous for more authoritarian responses than we may have thought was their intention originally. In other words, I mistrust statements that are soft and squishy. I want to see clear, tangible statements explicitly, for instance, that the World Health Organization does not have the authority to impose any restrictions on, for instance, the British people, any mandates for what pharmaceuticals or medical interventions they shall take. There is no regulation allowing the bypassing of your public health authority and its oversight. This is the type of language I want to see, is clear and explicit barriers to overreach from the World Health Organization, such as we have seen with lockdowns, masking, and so many other things that have done such deep damage to the economics and the populace of your great country.
Thanks, Dr. Malone. Andrew, is it, when you listen to that, and clearly it's a fast-moving or it's a developing story, and do you feel it is possible that these IHR documents that we're not directly referring to here may actually be more troublesome?
Well, I think the actual documents, and that's why I say I would urge everybody to start with the document itself rather than speculate. So 32 pages, you can read it, doesn't take that long. The language is not mandatory language, which your guest was mentioning. It is encouragement or recommendation, so it is that sort of softening approach. But you're right, let's raise the concerns. Let's make sure, I'm a lawyer, as you know, I like to have clarity in the documents. If there are these ongoing concerns, let's get further clarity in the language. But at the moment, the 32-page document makes it clear that sovereignty remains, and a lot of these fears are unfounded. That's what the document says.
Dr. Malone, finally, do you feel that you're overturning the apathy that has been out there? You know, the people don't seem, general populations don't seem to be paying too much attention to this. Do you see any shift of traction?
That, to be honest, that's very difficult to answer because I acknowledge that I am in a bubble. For instance, when we testified for the third International COVID Summit in Brussels earlier this week, we're surrounded by MPs and others, interested parties, alternative media, that is all of a similar frame of mind to those of us that we're speaking. The dominant party in Romania is also of that opinion, but that is not a universal opinion. And is there a shift? It appears that there has been a major political shift in Australia. It appears that the changes in COVID policy in Switzerland and the new data about what the effects of the various policies have been in Sweden compared to the rest of Europe suggests that there is increasing momentum. My sense is there's much more momentum in the European continent. As was recently noted, the polling in the UK suggested that if lockdown was a party, it would win going away. And so I really can't infer about the population in Great Britain. I do sense that there is some shift in momentum, but I don't want to become overly enthusiastic prematurely.
It's so important that you raise this subject and that you keep pushing this in front of us for our consideration. I've run out of time again. Dr. Robert Malone, thank you so much for your time. After the break, we'll be speaking to a public law barrister who may or may not be able to reassure me that the WHO treaty poses nothing we need to worry about. Welcome back. Now, Francis Hoare is a public law barrister, ideally qualified, therefore, to help us weigh up the pros and cons of proposed changes to the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty. Francis joins me now, I hope.
Done.
Francis, hi.
Good evening, Neil.
Does this thing have teeth that bite, or does it not?
I think it does. And I think we have to go back, firstly, given what your last commentator, your guest, was saying, to the overall principles, which is that this is a document in international law, not in domestic law. So the first point to make is it is correct to say that of itself, this doesn't change our domestic law, because international law is an obligation between member states to comply with certain terms and conditions, which includes this. The second point to make is that the lawyer in the studio is correct to say that the language in the treaty, as Dr. Malone also said, is not binding directives. It is binding or non-binding recommendations. The rather odd language used at points in different versions of the treaty, because of course these are amendments that are under negotiation, they're not final, is non-binding or binding recommendations. It's difficult to see what a binding recommendation is, other than that is intended to be a duty. So in theory, yes, these are simply recommendations. They're in international law. They're obligations to the United Kingdom as a state rather than domestic legal law. However, we need to look for the reality of the situation to the experience of the last 3 years. And we need to look back in the history of the international health regulations. The Public Health Act 1984, that was used to implement all the lockdown regulations without exception, and the mask regulations, the travel regulations, and everything else besides. Not the Coronavirus Act, the Public Health Act 1984 was in fact that as amended in 2008. And it was amended to give effect to the international health regulations that applied at that time. And that's important because, of course, the fact is that this could be implemented in domestic law. That's one point. But the second point is this. Dr. Malone suggested that there might be enforcement mechanisms, and he suggested that perhaps in future the World Trade Organization might be used to put pressure on governments if they were not implementing the recommendations, the non-binding recommendations, or the duties, or the binding recommendations, or whatever they call them, in the treaty. And that may or may not be right. But given the last 3 years, can we really say that if the WHO said there is a public health emergency, people will die if you do not do these things, nobody is safe until everyone is safe, do we really think that there would not be an extraordinary pressure to follow exactly what they said? And so, yes, it is correct to say that in theory, this doesn't change our sovereignty. In practice, it doesn't change our sovereignty. It's not like joining the EU, where we had EU law, which was binding insofar as we were members of the European Union. It's not like that. However, it creates an enormous pressure, potentially, and probably practically and probably in reality, on any government in the UK or anywhere else to follow what was done, particularly given that we know how likely it is that the media and all the organisations in power and positions of authority in the state and influence will encourage the state to do what the WHO says.
Hypothetically, Francis, if you were representing a client and that client was a nation state intent on maintaining its sovereignty, would you advise your client to sign this treaty or not?
Well, I would strongly, it's a client of a nation state. I think the clients of the nation state are the people of the nations. And I strongly advise the government not to sign amendments to the international health regulations. And I would go further than that and say we need to go back to the 2008 amendments to the Public Health Act, which the Court of Appeal found in the case that I represented Simon Dolan on, challenging the first lockdown. The Court of Appeal found that gave government ministers on their own, Matt Hancock in most cases in this case, the authority to give regulations, make regulations which had gave the state unprecedented power over domestic life, and including and not limited to restricting when you could leave your house, businesses that could open and when they could open, and so on. I disagree with that interpretation still, and so do many other lawyers up to and including Lord Sumption. But regardless of that, the fact that the Court of Appeal has now found that, I think, means that we need to amend that to ensure that Parliament, the ministers cannot do that, at least without parliamentary scrutiny on a regular basis, as would be the case if ministers were required to do it under other emergency legislation.
Andrew Eborn, it begs the question, doesn't it? If it's toothless, if it doesn't matter, why would anybody sign it anyway? No,
you're absolutely right, and we discussed this off air, which was one of those sort of interesting things. The basic ideal of the WHO was completely laudable, to make sure that it's One Health effectively, so it's trying to address those sort of things. But you're right, you need to look at that and beg that question.
Francis Hoare, thank you very much. Andrew Eborn, thank you so much. That's all for this week. Thanks to my guests, Kay Lindley, Dr. Robert Malone. Next up, it's the Common Sense Crusade, and I will see you, if I get my breath back, next Saturday.